All Happy Inventor videos are for educational purposes only. Welcome to the Happy Inventor. Today I'm going to continue my discussion of the RAGNER cylinder and many of the key systems that are required for that space station to support life. I'm also going to cover how many people can actually be housed on this space station, a number of which I think you'll be surprised about. So let's get started and enjoy. Before I discuss the specifics of the RAGNER cylinder, I want to review some of the prior art spacecraft and space stations we discussed last episode. And this is important because the prior art tells us what has already been invented, and we don't want to have to reinvent things, and we also want to have an idea of what is necessary for a working system, whatever invention area we happen to be inventing in. In this case, we're working with space stations, so I'm going to go over some of the space stations and spacecraft that we discussed last episode real quickly to remind you what the mass per person was for those stations. Because remember, we have to lower the mass per person so that we can lower the cost per person of any particular space station. And this cost per person is a vital factor in determining whether a space station is even viable. And so we're going to be looking at that, plus we're going to be also looking at life support systems, radiation shielding, debris shielding, and other things in this episode, all in the effort to make the RAGNER cylinder a viable space station. So let's go ahead and get started, and I think we'll look at the International Space Station first, which is the lightest space station we're going to discuss here at 450 tons. And for its 6-person crew, that means 75 tons per person. Next, we're going to look at the Starship Enterprise, which isn't exactly a space station, but it is a nice intermediate size to look at 190,000 tons. And this gives its crew approximately 442 tons per person. Now, Babylon 5 is also around that at 458 tons per person, but that's without any radiation shielding, or very little. If you add the radiation shielding to protect the station, then you're up around 1,100 tons per person. And if we go to the O'Neill cylinder, which is even larger, if we use the entire interior surface, we're at around 2,100 tons per person for a very, very massive space station. If instead we use one of the older O'Neill cylinder designs where we have large windows, we're talking about over 7,000 tons per person. All of these would be extremely expensive, and we're going to endeavor to reduce this mass per person as now we look at the RAGNER cylinder. And as you can see, the RAGNER cylinder is large, 10 kilometers by 60 kilometers, or about a little over 6 miles by 37 miles. This is big. Slightly larger than the O'Neill cylinder, and I have picked those numbers for a very specific reason that we will see soon. Notice the RPM is very, very low. The outer edge is actually moving at a very high speed, so there's a lot of kinetic energy in this space station. Notice also that I have set the safety margin for the outer shell, which is just the outer shell here, at 3, and then the safety margin for the inner shells or inner tori at 2. This could be changed to make it a little bit safer. It doesn't change the values that much, and so it might be something we might look at here in just a second. Distance between floors. If you remember, each one of these tori have multiple floors in it, and this is defining what the distance between the floors are. And I've chosen 3 meters, which is approximately 10 feet. So fairly high ceiling. If you have floors that are 1 foot thick, then for structural support, then you have about a 9-foot ceiling on all the floors, which is pretty reasonable height for a ceiling. Gives you the sense that you have more space inside the space station. And the spacing between the shells, or actually the thickness of the tori, I have set at 250 meters. This is pretty large. 250 meters is pretty thick. It's enough room for 83 floors on each one of these, in each one of these tori, and at 3 meters per floor. If we change the meters per floor, then the number of floors you would have would change. But notice that we have actually 17 plus 1, 2, 3 separate floors. We have 20 tori in this particular space station because of its large diameter and the numbers that we have chosen here. And For the flooring itself, the support, I have 30 kilograms per square meter, which I think is fairly reasonable. It takes into account not only the flooring, but also the supports on the sides and the supports that are connecting the top and bottom of the torus. This may be a little bit too small, but again, we've got 83 floors, and each floor has a whole lot of square meters in it, and the floors themselves probably do not weigh anywhere close to 30 kilograms per square meter, so the rest of that mass is all in the side structures, the wall structures that is supporting the floors. And I've been very generous with the furnishings, 15 kilograms per square meter, and if you look up here, we have 23 billion tons of furnishings inside the space station, and if you compare that number to the actual mass of the outer shell, that outer wall, they're almost the same weight. So we've got a lot of furnishings in there, a lot of flooring in there, and the mass is considerable for this space station, right around 200 trillion kilograms or 200 billion tons. So very massive. The question now I want you to ask is, I've plotted out the population for this space station. What do you think? Well, Neil cylinder originally was 1 million people per cylinder. The solid one could take up to around 4 or 5 or 6 million people. If you want to feed them, you probably have to limit it to around 1/4 to 500,000 people. So how many people can we put on the space station? You give up? Are you ready for this? I'm pretty sure you haven't guessed what the number is, but maybe. It is the entire world's population, 8 billion people in this one station. That's about the size of a small city. Cities that are about 100,000 to 150,000 might be this size. So going 3 dimensions makes a big difference. As you can see here, 8 billion people as opposed to, say, 200,000 people in a city that's all flat. And that's simply because we have so many floors. Each one of the tori, or each shell, has 83 floors in it. And so for a total number of floors of 1,667 floors, and that, remember, every floor is circular, so it goes all the way around the cylinder, not just on one side. So you have 1,600 on this side and 1,600 on this side. They're actually the same floor. They go all the way around the entire torus. And so that was kind of shocking to me when I calculated that, and that's why I picked the numbers I did up here, is because I wanted to show you that it is actually reasonable to put the entire world's population on a single space station. Now, notice that our life support, we only got 6 days, about 6.5 days of life support without getting the CO2 level above 1% and basically becoming toxic. And this is not as great as I would want. We can fix that by simply going a little bit larger, say 4 meter spacing, and now we're over a week of air, 8.5 days of air supply without any kind of life support operating. And this is in sharp contrast to almost all the movies, Star Trek and Star Wars and all of them. The life support shuts off and all of a sudden everyone's dying within minutes. And the truth is, if you have reasonable amount of space, such as 186 square meters, which is right around 2,000 square feet, and you have a fairly high ceiling, you've got a lot of time and a lot of air to breathe before you're going to be in trouble. And so, can 1 billion people get off this space station in 8 days? No. But there'd be backup life supports to keep things going for much, much longer than this. And hopefully things can be fixed within a month or so that you're not going to have a problem. Now, notice the number of people has gone down. When I raised the distance between the floors, I increased it by essentially 33%, and we reduced our population by 25%. And so we're down to only 6 billion people. I may have said million before, but that's 6 billion people. And about 8 days of air without any kind of life support. Hopefully we will have plants on board, lots and lots of plants, so that even if everything failed, the plants would continue to produce an oxygen through photosynthesis for a little time after that, especially if we have lighting going on, to spur them to photosynthesize. But plants will not be able to produce a significant amount of oxygen simply because they are not very efficient at converting energy such as light into oxygen. Thus, other CO2 removal systems are going to be needed, such as this zeolite system that uses 2 canisters of zeolite to alternately absorb CO2 and then reject that CO2 out into space. Now, for our system, we may not want to lose that CO2 because it has both carbon and oxygen that we'd be throwing away, and thus that might be piped somewhere and compressed or actually fed to algae to absorb it. But this is one system that could be used but would take electrical power to actually operate. And during a real emergency, we may not have a lot of electrical power. And because of that, we may use something like this, a lithium hydroxide cylinder that can absorb almost its own weight in CO2. Thus, this 3-kilogram canister that you see here can absorb almost 2 days worth of CO2 for one person. Thus, you might have a number of these in your actual home to provide emergency services, but likely the station itself will have industrial-sized versions of this designed for, say, 80 days and be made for about 100 people. Now that would mean that we would actually have on the RAGNER station 80 million of these industrial ones, and every person probably has a half a dozen of these canisters. And that weight compared to the overall weight of the station is not that much, and would come into play only during emergencies, but would be tested continually during the operation of the space station to ensure that all the systems are working properly. While emergency life support systems are very critical, I don't want to spend too much time here because in a future video I'm going to go over the structure of the RAGNER cylinder and how we might actually make real systems to provide the necessary functions. And remember, to have a real space station, all the necessary functions have to be there. And so in a future video, we will cover all those vital functions. But for right now, just consider one hypothetical way we could do this, and that is the space station could actually employ adding about 4% extra oxygen so that the atmosphere would be 25% oxygen. This would give us 5 or 6% drop in oxygen levels before any important problems would occur, and thus we would have 5 or 6 weeks before we would have to supplement the oxygen. Knowing that we have that extra oxygen, if we happen to use lithium peroxide, we have the advantage that we're not only removing CO2 from the atmosphere, but we're also adding about half the needed oxygen back into the atmosphere. And so that 5% or 6% of oxygen in the atmosphere could be supplemented and literally double the length of time that could be used if we were producing oxygen, or half the amount of oxygen we needed as we're scrubbing the CO2. And with lithium peroxide, it absorbs over its own weight in CO2, and thus a small amount of lithium peroxide can sequester a lot of CO2. And it works out to be about the body weight of the person if you wanted to scrub the CO2 from the atmosphere for approximately 90 days for a person. The amount of lithium peroxide you need is about the body weight of that person. And so if we do that, and that peroxide produces some of the oxygen, and the space station has about 25% oxygen to start off with, we literally could use the body weight of a person as a measure for how long we could have an emergency oxygen and CO2 scrubbing system that would operate for 90 days. And people themselves will probably have spacesuits and things like that, that if in real emergencies they can don that and get off the station. But this is one possibility for doing it where it wouldn't add too much weight, but would protect the breathing environment, at least, inside the space station with very little need for electrical power. But because we will need some electrical power, batteries or radioisotope thermoelectric generators might be used to provide the power for the fans and other systems. And so there's going to be many, many systems, and many of them are going to be regenerative if you have enough power, and there's going to be millions of them. And so having all of them go down at one time is really going to be nearly impossible. But you also want to have some security, such as having the lithium peroxide systems that can remove CO2 and provide added oxygen. Now, these systems probably will not be personal, but may be made for groups of 100 or 200 people that are living in basically a mini space station within the main RAGNER space station. And if that's the case, then you have 40 to 80 million of these systems running within the space station during an emergency. Thus, if a lithium peroxide system were employed, then you can see that the body weight of the people in the station, even at 8 billion people, is not that great. In fact, it's only slightly more than 10% of the weight of the atmosphere in the station. So this is a very small amount of mass to provide a lot of safety factor for the people on board. That extra 90 days of operation with reasonable amounts of oxygen and CO2 in the atmosphere gives the people plenty of time to either move off the station or to repair the life support systems and energy systems that might have been damaged. Now, what other things can we do here? You notice I've used a very strong material for the structure, but it's fairly heavy. It's stainless steel, so stainless steel is not light. If we decided, instead of using stainless steel, to go to, say, S-glass laminates, they're slightly less strong, 2350. However, their density is much, much less at only 2 grams per cubic centimeter. Now, to do that, notice that our thickness has gone way down because we've reduced the mass of the outer shell, and so that has changed. And I'm going to put this back to 3, so we're back up to the entire world population. And notice now that the mass per person is only 10 tons. This is crazy. But we've also only got 4 tons of shielding, because now we only have this 2 tons of basically fiberglass, which is not very protective. We've got a little bit of external shielding with our steel protection on the outside to protect us from debris, and a little bit of dirt, but it's still not enough. The actual shielding is only 2 tons per square meter and a total of 4.5 tons per square meter. So we may need some more shielding, but if we add it over here, it's rotating, and so it's going to add weight, which will cause this number to increase. So what we can do, I've set up a separate chart over here, and this is external shielding that is not rotating or is self-supporting. So in other words, it's rotating, but it doesn't put any stress on this outer shell. It's just rotating out there. And so if we do that, and that would basically be our outer shielding, if you wanted to call it, and we could make it out of steel, and we may add, let's say we don't want a meter of it, but let's say we take a 1/2 meter of steel and put it out there. Now that kicks us up to 8 tons per square meter, and it doesn't affect anything in our mass because I don't even count that as the rotating mass of the station. I probably should add that in there, but it is not in there. It's in these calculations, but it's not in this calculation here because it's only for the station mass, not the shielding mass or the station mass that has the shielding built in. Now, to get this up to 10, let's just add 1 meter of dirt, or add a 1/2 meter, and now we are at almost 10 tons per square meter, and we are pretty safe as far as shielding is concerned. Notice our thickness of our outer shell increased a little bit because we needed more strength as we added that extra tonnage to the outer shell, and that is reflected in this number here. Still got our 8 billion people, and we have very good shielding now with almost 10 tons of shielding per square meter. Now that brings our total mass per person up to 14.4 tons. And that number does include these 4 tons per square meter here and the mass of the shielding, and also the furnishings and the people. And so with that number of tons, we're up to a little over $700,000 to actually launch the system, and about $400,000 for the construction. Now that $400,000 might be a little low because I'm using 80% of the launch costs. Let's change that to actually the launch costs. Even if it's very bare bones with stainless steel walls and everything, that's still probably cheap because you'd still want to put inner walls and some kind of furnishings and wires and electrical systems and plumbing and all that, and we find the total cost being just a little over $1 million, about $1.25 million per person for a 2,000 square foot condo in space. This is very reasonable and very practical for a modern space station, except that we have 8 billion people on the station. So what we need to do is really just reduce the size of this. And instead of 10,000 meters or 10 kilometers, let's change that to 2,000. And instead of 60 kilometers long, let's change that to 5 kilometers long. All right. The rotation rate has gone up to almost 1 RPM. We've reduced the amount of kinetic energy in the system. We are only having to move at 99 meters per second on the outer edge of the space station. We're keeping the same spacing between the floors and the shells. And now we're at 11 tons per person. Our shielding has gone down to only 7.6 tons, which is a little under what we want, but not bad. And we could add some things here and add some things there. In low Earth orbit, this is great. We have a lot of shielding there. That's close to 1 meter of steel, which is pretty protective. And we got a little bit more of that, and plus we have 1 meter of neutron absorbing material and X and gamma ray absorbing material. So very, very good. Everything looks real nice. 11 tons per person. We're still just a little over $1 million. But now we only have to have 29 million people to be on the station. Can we find 29 million people to spend $1 million? Maybe. Maybe, especially if it's a very economically thriving place. We could see 28 million. That would be a very, very large city. In fact, the world's largest. I think Shanghai might be around that number. So everyone is within walking distance now. We're talking 3 miles from end to end. If you live in the middle, that's only 1.5 miles. In other words, you're only 20-minute walk away from just about anybody on the station. Probably don't need a lot of public transportation because of that, because everything's so close. And just a very nice system here. Very low mass per person, very low cost per person, very good shielding, and plenty of furnishings to make everyone happy and be able to take most of their stuff up there. They're getting 15 kilograms per square meter, which works out to about, for a 2,000 square foot, that's about 6,000 pounds. That's a lot. And most people will be bringing lightweight stuff just for the fact that it's expensive to bring it up into space, and the lighter things you get, the less expensive it is to bring it up there. Plus, it's a little bit higher quality stuff, probably made out of materials like carbon fiber and things like that. So there you have it. The RAGNER cylinder can come in multiple sizes. Now, if we wanted to give ourselves a little bit more ceiling space, we could change this back to 4 meters. That does increase our tonnage per person, but not outrageously. Now it's $1.25 million per person. And we may want to not make such large tori or thick tori, and we might want to change that down to maybe 100 meters. See, right now we have 63 floors. We change it to 100 meters. We've only got 25 floors per tori. Very easy to support, but it also increases our mass, but also increases our safety because there's more tori to run to in case one has a problem. So in general, this is the RAGNER cylinder, a hanging floor design where it's made up of concentric tori that each have multiple floors in it, so that you use the entire volume of the space station and not just the inner surface of a cylinder like the O'Neill cylinder. Next time we'll be looking at the complete RAGNER cylinder station, including solar panels and thermal radiators.